On behalf of Biblical Languages faculty, I'd like to welcome you here this evening. We have some exciting things happening in the Biblical Languages department. One of the reasons why Bobby is up here is to connect with some of us here at Multnomah. We're in the process of actually working with a Dead Sea Scroll fragment in one of the classes, so some of the students that are sitting over here are engaged in that process even now, and that's been an extremely exciting opportunity for us. I remember in 1992 having that opportunity when the Dead Sea Scrolls were first kind of released publicly in terms of publication, and being in a graduate seminar at the University of Wisconsin and getting to work with a fragment that had never been seen before. And I remember that experience as a graduate student, and having the opportunity to engage the students in that same process of discovery is just really, really exciting. And so we're really looking forward to the opportunity to have Bobby shared with us tonight, for you to get a look at not only the impact of the Dead Sea Scrolls on your own English Bibles and the way that it touches your world, but also to get a little bit of an idea of what we're doing here at Multnomah and how Multnomah is interfacing with that project. So I'll turn this back over to Michelle. And
Thank you so much, Carl. I actually studied Hebrew when I was a student here at Multnomah under Carl's tutorialship. He let me parse names. So students, if you're hearing stories today about that student once upon a time who always wanted to parse a proper name, that was me. Was so diligent. There were so many options with all the Puel, Peel, and all of that. Yeah, I can't even remember. I'm not even going to try right now. I'm in the room of too many smart people. It's my privilege at this time to introduce our special guest speaker, Dr. Robert R. Duke. We know him as Bobby. He's been referred to as Bobby. That's, I think, what he prefers, but it just sounds so much cooler to say Dr. Duke. Bobby and his wife, Jenny, live in the LA area where they're foster parents. They have 2 biological twin boys, right? That's kind of cool. I'm a triplet. I think that's kind of cool. They have one that they've adopted and one that they are caring for right now. He graduated from Multnomah in 1996. That's whenever I came to Multnomah. We were kind of passing. We were just discussing this at dinner. Graduated in 1996 with a BA, and I think your major was biblical languages. Is that right? Okay, so way back then, this has been in your heart. Well, he went on from Multnomah and he got 2 masters and then a PhD around the studies of biblical languages. So he's like really smart. Can we be friends still? Yeah. He graduated with a master's in Hebrew Bible in 1999 and another master's in Hebrew literature in 2003, and then finally a PhD from UCLA in 2006. His areas of expertise include Old Testament, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and Second Temple Judaism. His 4-year experience studying in the Middle East has certainly influenced his perspectives and teaching. You're in for a treat, guys. He's a prolific writer, having written his dissertation on the Aramaic Qumran text. If I mispronounce anything, don't hold it against me, okay? I'm just reading. Visions of Amram, of course. I should remember the gutturals. Published in 2010, as well as articles and book chapters in Dead Sea Discoveries and the Scandinavian Journal of the Old Testament, as well as others. He's devoted much of his time and research to improving pedagogy and biblical studies, as he has investigated how service learning and community-engaged teaching can improve student retention of course material. For languages, this is really good. Julia was even asking, what if I don't know? Can I ask questions? I said, I think he might have some interaction going on tonight. So, he's got some background studies in that. So I'm sure that he'll provide opportunity for some engaging there. Sorry, Poppy. I know this is laborious for you. Among his many awards, he received the Rotary Ambassadorial Scholarship that allowed him to study at Hebrew University in 2000 and 2001. He was a fellow at the Albright Institute of Archaeological Research in 2005. And today, in addition to his teaching responsibilities at APU, yes, he does teach at APU, but that's all you're getting, Rick, okay? He's not a graduate of APU. I know. I know, right? This is something about alumni directors. Whenever we have alumni out there doing really cool stuff, we like to brag. We're like proud mamas and proud daddies. So whenever they're from us, you can't claim them. Like, they're ours. And actually, Bobby, I just want you to come up right now. Just set the record straight, because I did hear this. I did hear that you were falsifying the facts. So... So just to make it clear, I want to make sure, Bobby, whenever you go back home to, that place where the sun shines all the time, that you're proudly sporting.
It was 85 degrees today.
Would you wear it anyway? Please.
I would wear it anyway.
Proudly promote your alma mater.
Absolutely.
Okay. Do y'all drink coffee down there in Southern California? Everyone drinks coffee, right? You know what? I think it will hold a cold drink as well as a hot one.
Excellent.
So
That's a heavy mug.
I know it's quality. It's Multnomah. Yeah. So for those of you who are alumni here tonight, we do have a gear store. It's not open right now, but you can go online and you can purchase little paraphernalia like that. For that's a bad word. I shouldn't use that word. Yeah, memorabilia. Yeah, that's what I meant, right? You probably have more of that than we do. Okay, y'all didn't come to hear me. You came to hear Dr. Bobby Duke. So I'm going to let him take the show. Will you please help me welcome Dr. Robert Duke? Sorry. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for being here tonight. As Michelle was saying, I have always gone by Bobby, and actually my middle name is Ray, so it's Bobby Ray. My wife from Texas, East Texas, her middle name is Lynn, so it's Bobby Ray and Jenny Lynn. So I thought if the PhD hadn't worked out, we were going to maybe go country western band or something. But my wife and I, we did meet in Jerusalem. She was a study abroad student with Philadelphia Biblical University. She was a double major Bible and elementary education. And our first conversation, her roommate locked her out of her hotel room. My roommate locked me out of my hotel room. So we happened to be standing, seeing the sunset over the Mediterranean Sea in Haifa, Israel. And we were talking about Bloom's taxonomy. So any of you education majors here, you know Bloom's taxonomy. And that was it, love at first sight. You can't talk about Bloom's taxonomy without it going straight toward marriage. So just remember that. Guys, are any of you guys look up Bloom's taxonomy? Just bring it up during a meal and you're there. But we got married. We've been married 15 years. As Michelle was mentioning, we have our boys, Zachary and Jeffrey, and then Mariah and JC, which is our littlest one. And it's been just such a blessing, particularly in LA County, where there's a great need for foster parenting. And for my students at APU, we really invite them into our lives, because our goal, just like the goals here at Multnomah for the students, is that it's about life change. And hopefully tonight, as a Multnomah alum and then as an APU faculty member, you can see that one of the beauties of a Christian education is that we can have that kind of influence in the lives of our students that isn't necessarily high on the agenda in other types of educational institutions. So kind of tonight is a time for me just to have a family time with all of us as we are celebrating Multnomah's, how many years of education now? 78. And I think APU just finished their 115th. So it's quite amazing when you think of the years of education that's been going on. I am going to talk tonight as a Multnomah alum on kind of my journey since Multnomah, since I left in '96, that brings us up to the present. I'll be sharing some of the research I've done over the years, particularly with the Dead Sea Scrolls. I'm assuming that most of you have some understanding of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but I'll kind of hit at different levels tonight. So for some of you language people that I saw with your flashcards, you weren't really studying, you were just trying to impress Carl. We all know that. But it works. There it is. But I'll be showing some actual fragments so you can kind of practice looking at the text, but others I'll kind of hit at different levels. Really what brought me here tonight was Hobby Lobby. Anyone know what Hobby Lobby is? The closest one is in Federal Way, Washington. I've looked it up. So I want you guys to bypass Michael's. Forget Michael's. Get in your car, drive to Federal Way, go to Hobby Lobby, and buy lots of stuff. No, Hobby Lobby is owned by the Green family out of Oklahoma City. And a few years ago, the Greens became very committed to acquiring very important artifacts and biblical antiquities. Some of those do include Dead Sea Scroll fragments. Some of them include very important Torah scrolls, some very early King James Version Bibles, and others. And eventually, all of this material will be housed in a museum in Washington, D.C. They've already acquired the property, and they're working with Washington, D.C. city planners right now to have that building approved for all the different designs that they need to do. So it really is kind of an exciting season. But in connection to the Green Collection, they have a research arm that's called the Green Scholars Initiative, and that's where the Multnomah students become involved, and my students at APU, because the Green Scholars Initiative will farm out items in their collection if and only if professors are willing to work with their students on the research. This is very unique among humanities scholarship. People in the sciences for years have had very close relationships with the professor and the students working in a lab on something, whatever it is that they're researching. But in the humanities, it's historically been the professor going off in a library by themselves, doing research on their own, and then just coming back and kind of sharing some knowledge to their students and then disappearing again. Whereas this makes it a classroom become more of a lab. And it actually is a way that, how I worded it, kind of decentralizes the professor and actually makes the material that you and the students are working on together something that is very, very important. Because there will be moments when you're looking at something like a Dead Sea Scroll fragments or others where even you as a professor have to look at your students and say, I'm not sure I see what you see. Let's think about this again. Let's wrestle with it. And particularly this generation of students really likes that organic experience with the classroom. So the Green Scholars Initiative, I was actually up here in Portland. I was coming up here to meet with Carl and Becky and then some professors over the next couple days down at George Fox to get research teams all over the Portland area. I'd really like to see Portland become a major hub for Green Scholars initiatives here in the Pacific Northwest to outshine Seattle. I mean, maybe Seattle gives us good coffee and grunge bands or something, but really with Multnomah and George Fox being right here in this area, we can have some major research going on with the Green Scholars Initiative. One other item I did want to mention for any of you students out there that might be interested in archaeological dig. APU, in partnership with Hebrew University and Cornell University, began their first season of digging up very north in the country of Israel at a place called Avel Beit Ma'acha. It is way up near the border with Lebanon, and in the first season they've already hit 10th century BC remains. It's pretty incredible. We've had our Alumni magazine or our APU Life magazine just had a big spotlight on it. But there are ways to get credit that you can maybe transfer if you're very interested in doing an archaeological dig. And the archaeological community is excited. They said this is one of the most exciting digs that's come about since maybe the Megiddo dig, just because this is a biblical site. It is known in the end of 2 Samuel, where you have Sheva's rebellion that actually ends with his head being thrown over the walls because the wise woman of Avel said, let's cut his head off. And it doesn't get more fun than that. I mean, that's just a great, great story. But so there are some really kind of fun and exciting things going on among Christian colleges and universities, particularly with the Green Scholars Initiative, with archaeological digs and others. Well, transitioning back to the Dead Sea Scrolls. I mean, how did I get involved in the Dead Sea Scrolls? My first year here at Multnomah was 1992. I came up from a place called Yucaipa, California, not too far from Palm Springs. Can anything good come out of Yucaipa is what I've heard, and then they say things like that. That's why you always keep the name Bobby, because you're from Yucaipa. I mean, there's nothing doctor about you. But in 1991, I was a year away from graduating from high school. One of my high school friends, his mother had just read this U.S. News and World Report, knew I was interested in the Bible, knew I was looking into ministry, knew I was looking into different colleges and Bible colleges and Christian universities. So she handed me this U.S. News and World Report and said, I think you'll like it, keep it, read it. And I remember reading it in 1991 going, this is amazing that people get to do this kind of stuff. Carl already mentioned that in the early 90s, you had the Huntington Library down in Southern California, you had the Ancient Biblical Manuscript Center in Claremont, California, and others that had microfiche of all the scrolls. And finally, the Huntington Library in 91 said, no more are we going to allow a small group of scholars to have access to these. We are going to make our microfiche available to any scholar worldwide that wants to come here and study them. And it really revolutionized Dead Sea Scroll research. So if you think in 1948 when the first caves, 47, 48, when the first caves were discovered, up through 57 when the last cave was discovered, till 91, there was a small group of scholars that had access. 1991, the door came open, and then now with the Green Scholars Initiative, undergrad students are getting access to material and research that people could not have dreamed of 20 years ago. So it truly is an amazing experience. Well, I finished at UCLA, focused on an Aramaic text that I'll mention in a little bit, and came to APU, not a place known for Dead Sea Scrolls research. In fact, I made the mistake in an alumni event. We have a very, very famous alumni named Brian Clay. He won the gold medal in the Beijing Olympics and the silver at the one before that. Well, here he was, the decathlete for the U.S. team at the Olympics, wins the gold medal, and I was in an alumni event, and I said, now, what's the name of that track guy again? And the looks in the room were, you've forgotten the name of our greatest alumnus ever. So, but when I came to APU, Dead Sea Scrolls research, our special collections, it didn't have items that actually connected to what my research was, so therefore I started transitioning into what Michelle was mentioning, service learning. So I've had a great time, even with my Hebrew language classes, partnering with local congregations and local senior centers with my Hebrew classes, doing Passover demonstrations. So my students have to memorize all the blessings and then go and give them, and then we have to eat the matzah and the horseradish and all of that kind of fun stuff. But even a language class, you can turn it into something that you can connect with the outside community. Because I think the outside community needs to know what goes on in our walls, whatever institution we have. But in 2009, it was March of 2009, and it was Friday the 13th, March 2009. It will always be seared on my mind, because the Monday of that week, our interim dean at our School of Theology came to me and said, you need to be at a meeting this Friday with the president and some members of the board, and I can't tell you what it's about. That was on a Monday. I had to wait till Friday to get to that meeting. Well, I get to the meeting not knowing what was going to happen, and it turned out that my university was going to acquire Dead Sea Scroll fragments. It was around the same time the Greens started also acquiring fragments, because there's been families that since 1947 have had items in vaults in Europe that finally they're making accessible to universities and other people to acquire. So overnight, I got pulled right back into the Dead Sea Scrolls world. And from that, various balls started rolling, and eventually got connected to the Greens, and was really excited the day I got to call Carl and say, Carl, I want to see Multnomah get on board with what's going on here. And it's been great partnering and getting to know. But we have 5 Dead Sea Scroll fragments: Leviticus, 2 of Deuteronomy, Daniel, and then one that's most likely Exodus. It's debated. We're almost finished with the publication of them with the Princeton Theological Seminary volume. And we did have a wonderful exhibit of our items down in 2010. So from that magazine to then in 2009 to be able to start working with items, and then now with the Green Scholars Initiative, it's been an amazing journey to see a junior, senior in high school say how cool it would be to work on these, to all of these various events that have now lined up. And Multnomah really was the springboard to all of that. Here at Multnomah, I did not take any Hebrew. One, because they didn't offer Hebrew back then, but I took a lot of Greek. In fact, Rex Koivisto was my final Greek professor. But just getting involved in biblical languages was really the thing that made me realize this is something that is utterly important to do. Now, I'd say I had really kind of 2 key moments at Multnomah that then moved me toward where I am today, because I was ministry bound. From the time I was 6th grade, I would tell my guidance counselors all through high school, I'm going to be a pastor someday. Well, I came to Multnomah, intent on that. And then in 1994, October of 1994, my roommate here at Multnomah, and we were high school friends, we were childhood friends, but he came to Multnomah to play basketball, but he actually died in Whitehall. Some of you may have heard the story, but Mark Brown played for the basketball team at Multnomah, and one morning heard him gagging, and he actually died of a heart attack. Well, that sent me on a tailspin. I mean, emotionally and every other way, kind of really trying to figure out, how does this all work? Why does this happen? I mean, all those kind of theodicy questions that I'll bring up in a little bit of like, why do these kinds of things happen? So once I graduated from Multnomah, I said, I'm out of here. And that's when I went to Jerusalem for the first time. And one of my uncles would joke with me saying, oh, you're just going to the Middle East to find yourself. And in some ways, I think he was right. Another key event, and it was the last semester I was here at Multnomah, there was J.P. Moreland. Some of you may know J.P. Moreland from Biola. he was up here doing some kind of special debate with Marcus Borg on Jesus Seminar stuff. And then he actually did a presentation at Central Bible. So I went to hear that. I really don't remember anything he said at Central Bible except for this quote. During his talk, he mentioned John Wesley and read this quote to us, and it kind of cut me to the heart, particularly because at that point I was still thinking ministry would be the route I would go. But John Wesley in the 18th century said the following: "Do I understand Greek and Hebrew? Otherwise, how can I undertake, as every minister does, not only to explain the books which are written therein, but to defend them against all opponents? Am I not the mercy of everyone who does understand, or even pretends to understand the original? For which way can I confute his pretense? Do I understand the language of the Old Testament critically at all? Can I read into English one of David's Psalms, or even the first chapter of Genesis? Do I understand the language of the New Testament? Am I a critical master of it? Have I enough of it to read in English the first chapter of St. Luke? If not, how many years did I spend at school? How many at the university? And what was I doing all those years? I'm not ashamed to cover my face." APU, where I teach now, it has a Wesleyan heritage, and we actually have a statue of John Wesley right out in front of our library. What I love about him is he was only about 5'4", if the statue's correct, so that's my good man right there. But I will take my first semester Hebrew students, we'll stand right in front of the Wesley statue, and I'll read this to them, and I'll say, now when someone asks you, you say, "That statue right there told me I have to take Hebrew." But this quote for me really kind of hit me that I said, you know what, I really need to learn the languages. And that's when I decided to go to Jerusalem and start studying Hebrew. I'll still remember my last week, because I worked at a youth group down in Lake Oswego at Lake Bible Church. They gave me a send-off. They had a cake made for me that now I know it said shalom on it. I had no idea what it said on it in 1996. They didn't know what it said either. All they told us said, go find some Jewish word to put on this cake. So they had the word shalom written on it, and I had a picture of it, so I went back later and said, oh, that's what it said. And it was just these squiggly lines. But from 96 to 98, I was at the Institute of Holy Land Studies in Jerusalem. That's where I met my wife. Then eventually went on to Hebrew University and then UCLA. But really it was this quote that kept pushing that direction. And as doors kept opening, I really started seeing that it was education that was really where I was going to minister most effectively. And I love being at a school like APU, and Multnomah is the same, where you can blur the lines between education and ministry, because you really can get into the lives of the students. So tonight, as I talk about the scrolls, I really am starting with three presuppositions of everyone in this room. First is that all of you are here because you have a deep love for Scripture. I mean, you're coming out on a Wednesday night, 6:30, in this freezing cold. Okay, I'm a Californian there, in slightly tepid temperatures or something. But all of you have a deep love for Scripture, and you want to know, why do I hear about the Dead Sea Scrolls? Why do I hear about Qumran? So what? How does it change the way I read the Bible? Second, some of you in here can actually give me a nice detailed explanation of why Qumran is important. Maybe you've read some books. Maybe along the way someday you read one of the textbooks, an Introduction Vanderkam's or something else that talked about the scrolls, so you have a little bit more knowledge. And then there are some of you in here, because of your Hebrew training, you can read it in the original state. So I'm really going to try to hit all of you with different things tonight to do that. So three key concepts I want to push: how modern translations incorporate Qumran data, how Qumran data can help us read modern translations more inquisitively, and I'll get to that soon, and how Qumran ideology in non-biblical texts, so these sectarian documents, what they're often labeled, should caution us in our interpretation of modern translations. One of the biggest issues a lot of my freshman students at APU wrestle with is not what is in the Bible, it's how can we all be reading the same Bible and all disagree so intently, particularly we Protestants. If you ever look at a Protestant family tree, you're like, how many branches can this tree have? And they're trying to figure out, okay, why is there so much diversity? And some of it is because different groups over the history have kind of focused, sometimes in an unhealthy way, on certain passages to the neglect of others. So we're going to look at one text at a Qumran sectarian document to at least bring up some ideas of how should this give us some humility and caution when we're reading the text to make sure that we are being kind of humble in the process. So to illustrate these 3 points, I'm going to use 3 different documents. The first I'm going to use is 4Q Samuel A biblical document. The second one, I'm going to use the text that I used for my dissertation, 4Q Visions of Qumran. It is also numbered 4Q 543 to 547. Now, the 4Q numbering means it was found in K4 of Qumran. And then it's sometimes given the title, but it's also sometimes listed by the number. Because K4 was huge, so there were hundreds and hundreds of documents that have been identified from K4. Of the 11 caves, K4 was really the mother lode of Dead Sea Scrolls text. And then finally, I'm going to look at a text called 1Q Pesher to Habakkuk and explain what is a Pesher, what was in Habakkuk the sectarian community found interesting. So to begin, how modern translations incorporate Qumran data using 4Q Samuel A. We're going to use Samuel as a test case because many Dead Sea Scrolls text critical scholars will say that some items that come out in the Samuel text are the most significant and will change English translations going forward. So let's start off with a simple one that we are all aware of when it comes to Goliath's height. So some of you Hebrew students, what word is that? Shesh, good, good. What, does anyone know what it means? 6, there we go. Oh, making me so proud tonight. So, by the way, is Emily Peck here? I'll be giving autographs afterwards. I guess for some reason, Emily and I just met. Hi, Emily. She kept saying my name in class today because she thought it sounded funny. I know your type. I have students like you at APU. So, Shesh, 6 cubits. Now, a cubit is the span from your middle finger to your elbow, basically. It's a measuring device we always have on us. So 6 cubits, which in our English translations, you can see they will give it to numbers that we're familiar with, or they will, sometimes English translations will say 6 cubits, and then a little footnote. You'll look at the bottom of the page, and they'll say, that is whatever it is in our measurements. Which is roughly, with 6 cubits in a span, 9 feet tall. Now, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found and 4Q Samuel A was identified, there were some key passages that started popping out of giving us new insight into some of these items. So the red here that you can see is not the same word as this one. The word arba, 4 cubits and a span. Well, 4 cubits in a span is about 6.5 feet tall, which is still gigantic to me. Still quite large. Probably was still very large in the Iron Age. But for some reason, from the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls to the Masoretic text that we have on the bottom, there was a textual variant. Now, numbers are ones that, for all of you that study textual criticism, either New Testament or Old Testament, numbers are ones that can often have variants. There is a Latin variant in Samuel that has Goliath to be something like 20-some feet tall. If you look at the apparatus in the Biblical Hebraic as Stucartensi in your BHS. Now, with my students, I look at these variants and say, this gives us some interesting issues of scribal transmission, but because of the scrolls being hundreds and hundreds of years earlier, this one is probably the more accurate. So we don't have to kind of get bent out of shape. It should excite us that we now have probably the most original reading of 4Q Samuel, or the text of Samuel. Another example, and here we have 2 English translations put side by side. We have the NRSV and the NIV. I know it's very tiny, so you can't read it, but can we say these 2 are not exactly the same English translation? Yes. Okay, just by looking at size, you can tell that the one on the left is giving us a little bit more data than the one on the right. Now, when I was here at AP or Multnomah years ago, people had other translations for these acronyms, NRSV and NIV. I think one of the ones often I think I even heard a professor say it once, NIV is the nearly inspired version, and non-received sacred versions or whatever. They had all these things, and it was moments like that said, you know what, if we're that concerned, we need to learn the original languages. And I was sharing today with Carl of a student I had at APU about a year ago. He came from a Muslim background, converted to Christianity, and about halfway through the semester one class, he raised his hand and said, I have got to share something with you. I said, sure, how about it? He's like, a lot of my Muslim friends, if they're going to take the Quran seriously, they're going to learn Arabic. I said, tell me more. Tell me more, because I had 30 students in this intro-level class, and it turned into a good conversation of how we can be considered, say, Bible scholars if we're not going to learn the original languages. Whereas I've seen people fight tooth and nail over which is the best English translation. Is it the NIV, NASB, NRSV, the Common English Bible, the Message? No, forget that one. No, I'm just kidding. Which one is it? And some of it is this should push us back to saying, do you know what? Let's kind of hunker in and do a little bit more research on our own. But the one on the left actually adds an entire paragraph that was found in 4Q Samuel A. So the NIV has the following: Saul also went to his home in Gibeah, accompanied by valiant men whose hearts God had touched. But some troublemaker said, "How can this fellow save us?" They despised him and brought him no gifts, but Saul kept silent. Then it jumps right into Nahash. Nahash the Ammonite went up and besieged Jabesh Gilead, and all the men of Jabesh said to him, "Make a treaty with us, and we will be subject to you." Now, we won't take time to read it, but if you go to Josephus's Antiquities, he has a more expanded telling of this event, which includes a paragraph on gouging out the eyes that is mentioned a little bit later in chapter 11. But a lot of scholars felt that Josephus was being a little bit exaggerating, or he was elaborating a little bit on his text when he was writing Antiquities, until the scrolls were found. And when the scrolls were found, the entire section that is in the NRSV here corresponds very closely to what Josephus was saying in that interim. Now, if you pick up Marty Abegg and Peter Flint and Eugene Ulrich's The Dead Sea Scrolls Bible, you can go buy it at Powell's or Barnes & Noble or any of them, they will say that this one variant is one of the most significant. Now, when I show this to my students, I will say, does this touch on anything really when it comes to major, like, Christian theological doctrine? I mean, it's kind of a violent, cool text, so my undergrad guys love it, and then they go play World of Warcraft or whatever they do when they should be studying. But it is an interesting one, but it really doesn't touch on any key theological concepts. So it excites me that we're one step closer to the original text. Next concept tonight: how Qumran data can help us read modern translations more inquisitively. I think sometimes when we come to the text, we're a little bit like the children like my son's age, where we've been in Sunday school now all of these years, and we know the answer before the question's even been asked. Kind of like, it's Jesus, that's the right answer. But it sometimes stops us from really looking deeply and inquisitively at a text. And that's something particularly my Jewish professors in Israel were they really instilled, is it's like, you got to read it really, really closely. So let me tell you a little bit about 4Q Visions of Amram, and why I think this should encourage us to go back to our English translations and really read closely to say, what are things that we may have missed before? Because I think I'm going to put something up tonight none of us may have ever thought about. So why am I doing 4Q Visions of Amram? Well, you always go to the home team advantage here. This was my dissertation, and I published a dissertation back in 2010. But one of the kind of key insights from this text, I think we've recovered what was at least discussed as a Hebrew name for Moses before he was called Moses. Now, why would I say that? Here is the text, or at least the beginnings of it, and some of the apocalyptic nature of it. It's a very visionary text. In Qumran documents, when you see the brackets, that means there is a hole in the leather. So scholars have to fill that in. But I'm just going to read a little bit just to give you a sense of the type of text it is. I saw in my vision, and my here is Amram. Who's Amram? Moses' father. Good. That's on that. Do we still take the Bible test here at the beginning and the end? That was great. It was always fun. I think it was in this room that I took it. People would be out there wondering, like, are they not going to let me graduate and all these things? And I said, no, they won't. You will not graduate. But Amram, Moses' father. So he's having these visions. This is a non-biblical sectarian document. But it gives us insights into when they read the biblical text, what are things that they ask questions about? I saw in my vision, the vision of the dream, and behold, two were judging over me and saying, then the text breaks off, belonging to him. And they were holding over me a great quarrel. And I asked them, from which of you thus? And then the text breaks off. And then it goes on, and you eventually, if we kept reading the text, you would see that there's these two angelic figures, like warring over kind of Amram's soul. It's this really fascinating text. Non-biblical. So what I was trying to do is figure out from this text that was not known in the history of literature until the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, and they found it in Cave 4. So what is the date of this document? What is this document's relation to others? What's the genre? Is this some kind of visionary apocalyptic text? And then what was the purpose? Like, why would someone write this text? So here are the material I'm dealing with. Here's 4Q 543. You can see what my students say looks like cornflakes. And when they say things like that, I say, get out of my class. Don't ever come in here again. You will show respect when there's a picture of Dead Sea Scroll fragments up. But here's 4Q 543. Here's 4Q 544, 4Q 545, 4Q 546, and 4Q 547. Now these are 5 copies of the exact same document. And why we know there's 5 copies is there's different scribal hands. So the very first thing I had to do with my dissertation was come back and just try to do columns of where do they overlap, where do they agree, and how can we reconstruct a larger text based on that. That is where Dead Sea Scroll scholarship is quite boring from that standpoint. But it also starts giving some very interesting insights into what's there. Now for the inquisitive nature, there's one line in this text right here in the middle that made me start scratching my head and say, where are they getting that? What are they thinking? Well, it's all about Moses' name. In Exodus chapter 2, it says, now a man of the house of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. We're all familiar with the story. Then it says, when the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She, and who's the antecedent of this she? Pharaoh's daughter, named him Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water. What did Amram and Yocheved call Moses for 3 months? Hey, you. Have any of you ever noticed that in the text? For 3 months, what was he called? Because it says here, Pharaoh's daughter called him Moses. I'd never noticed that before. But when I was dealing with this text for my dissertation, I came across this section, and I said, is this an author writing a pseudepigraphic text trying to at least answer that question that some precocious child asked during Jewish school? We all have those precocious children that ask some question, we're like, don't ask that. For 3 months, what was he called? In the what I call episode 1 of the text, it said, then when he had finished the days of the wedding feast, this was Miriam's wedding, he sent and called to Aaron his son, being 20 years old, and he said to him, call to me my son. And then we have this phrase, Malach Yah or Malach Yahu, your brother from the house of Pharaoh. Is this an author supplying a Hebrew name because for 3 months he had to have been called something? I mean, the biblical text doesn't tell us, but this bothered some ancient writer of a pseudepigraphic text. And it's all based on that section right there. Now, Émile Puech is a French scholar in Jerusalem. He was the only other one to ever look at this text, and it was all in French. So that's always beautiful. You find someone that's not done in English and say, you're the first authoritative English text. But he reads it a little different. He says that it's just what do you think that word is? Messengers, your brothers. Well, for all of you Hebrew students, can malak mean messengers? Yeah. I mean, straightforward, the word malak means messenger or angels. So that is possible. And he just has it a generic, non-proper noun, meaning the messengers your brothers, go call them. Whereas I suggested, well, maybe parsing proper nouns. Proper nouns. Are you good? Parsing proper nouns, Michelle. Maybe this is a proper name and not just a description. Maybe it should be read as your brother, Malach Yah. Well, what is Malach Yah or Malach Yahu? The messenger of the Lord. I mean, that's a good name for Moses. If you're going to write a pseudepigraphic text and you want to answer that question of 3 months, that's a great name for Moses. So here's the line blown up. Here's the word, Malach Yah. This is the part that is it your brother, your brothers, and then we have mean from the house. So we have the word either messengers, his messengers or something, or a proper noun, Malach Yah, from the house, and then the text breaks off. So I started playing around, got some Photoshop training here, and started mimicking letters from elsewhere in the document to see, could it be your brother, your brothers? Is it brothers plural, brothers singular? And they all work. By cutting and pasting, they all work. So my argument can work because no one can prove me wrong otherwise. When it comes to Dead Sea Scrolls scholars, I'll often say pre-1991, a lot of people got tenure for writing on the Dead Sea Scrolls that they never would have after 1991. Because people were saying lots of crazy things about the scrolls, but because no one could challenge them, there wasn't anything that could be done. Well, once I started saying, well, could this in this document from the 1st, 2nd century BC be supplying a name for Moses during that 3-month window that Exodus doesn't tell us, but at least someone was curious about it, I started looking at later literature. So a text called Pseudo-Philo says, his mother called him Melchiel. Is that Stephen Curtis Chapman? Doesn't that sound like Stephen Curtis Chapman? Wow, that takes me back to Multnomah days. I actually went down with Pammy Cacho to Salem to see Stephen Curtis Chapman do a concert back way in the day. Back during his first couple albums. Now he's on his, 50th album or something. But in Pseudo-Philo, Yocheved, Moses' mother, called him Melchiel. Well, Malachiah and Melchiel, that's pretty close. It's either now more of kind of the messenger or king of God versus El and then in the Tetragrammaton. And the child was nursed and became glorious above all other men, and through him God freed the sons of Israel as he had said. Another text, Clement of Alexandria, said the parents gave a name to the child, and he was called Joachim, and he had a third name in heaven after his ascension, and the mystics say Melchi. Two later Christian historians, the daughter of Pharaoh renamed him Moses. Previously by his parents, he was called Melchias, for Melchias is interpreted king. Well, how do you say king in Hebrew? Some of you Hebrew students. Melech. Malach, Melech's very close. And then for they say that Moses, having been born, was called Melchias by his parents, the one who is king. Well, even later on, a Syriac work called the Book of the Bee says when Moses was born, Pharaoh the king commanded to throw the newborn children of the Israelites into the river. Moses was beautiful in appearance, and he was called Pantil and Amlakyah. That is very close to Malakyah. And this is one of those moments in scholarship where you start scratching it, and all of a sudden you realize, I just hit a gold mine. Fantastic. Turned into a great Dead Sea Discoveries article, but it was just interesting trying to get in the mind of a writer from 2,000 years ago that was bothered about one issue. What was Moses called for 3 months? None of us here probably ever noticed that in the biblical text or even thought to ask. But in other cultures, names are very important. We give names mostly now for how they sound with our last name, or we want to make them, everyone in our family has to have J's, or everyone else in our family had, back then, names were utterly significant and actually kind of stamped and imprinted somebody. So for an ancient reader of the book of Shemot, Exodus, to come across that would have jumped right out at them. What was this child called by his parents? Because Pharaoh's daughter called him Moses. Now, a couple other items, Philo, some of you know, he really plays off of this king concept. And most likely he may have been familiar with at least a tradition that Moses had a name like Malach or Melech that was there. For some persons say, and not without some reason and propriety, that this is the only way by which cities can be expected to advance in improvement. If either the kings cultivate philosophy or philosophers exercise the kingly power. But Moses will be seen not only to have displayed all these powers, the genius of the philosopher and of the king in an extraordinary degree at the same time, but 3 other powers likewise. And then it goes on from there. Now, one of the things then to consider is, was there this Melech, Malach issue going on in the Second Temple period? So for all of you that had Greek and Hebrew, here we have an interesting text in Hebrew and in Greek. Is that the same word as that for all of you that are trilingual here tonight? No. What is this? Messenger. And what is this? King. So even there we have an interesting Melech, Malach going on. So that's why I think even though from the Amram document it's messenger of the Lord, it then shows up in other texts as like the Lord is king or something like that. So I won't take time to show you that this actually shows up all over Dead Sea Scrolls text where you have the word melech and an aleph that has been put in later above the line. Very interesting. So some of the scribal practice, even 1Q Isaiah A, the great Isaiah scroll, has some of this issue going on with some scribal variants when it comes to these words. Now, just noting that when it comes then to inquisitiveness, I mean, when I stumbled upon that, I said, wow, this is so interesting to get into the minds of these ancient writers to see what they were dealing with and what they thought was something that was significant or important. And it shows up there right in the text. So one final kind of concept to think about tonight is how Qumran ideology in non-biblical texts should caution us in our interpretation of modern translations. Now, when the scrolls were first discovered, it was the biblical texts that were the most exciting at first, because everyone wanted to know how accurate were the Masoretes, and in general, we can be very confident in the text and the translations we have. Very, very confident. But it was actually these non-biblical sectarian documents that were not known in the history of literature that were really the most important for the history of Jewish ideology and the understanding of Second Temple Judaism. And one interesting text is 1Q Pesher to Habakkuk. 1Q P Habakkuk. Now the word Pesher that I'll define in a minute, I can clearly remember when Walt Kaiser was here at Multnomah many, many years ago. He made a joke during chapel, none of us undergrads got, and 3 or 4 of the faculty chuckled. And at lunch, I grabbed Ray Lubeck. I still remember, I sat across from Ray Lubeck, and I said, what did he mean when he said that text was put through the Pesher cooker? Well, he then explained to me all of these things about what Pesher was and what Walt Kaiser was talking about was this and that. So, I mean, it turned into this great conversation that still is embedded in my mind. Was the first time I heard this term Pesher from Walt Kaiser, and Ray Lubeck brought illumination to me because I was, there's a joke out there I didn't get, and I want to get that joke. If Walt Kaiser tells a joke, I want to understand it. But a Pesher is a text. Let me jump ahead. There we go. A Pesher is a method of interpretation which will often read modern events into the text. And there's more technical definitions for that, but in general, kind of a crude analogy is kind of holding the newspaper in one hand, your Bible in the other, and kind of going back and forth saying, this is that, this is that, this is that. So going back then to the biblical book of Habakkuk, the book itself, it really is kind of a theodicy, kind of really dealing with God's goodness and omnipotence in the view of the existence of evil. And I think it was in one of my classes here at Multnomah where just kind of the simple outline to try to stick it in our minds was given me, that we have 2 questions Habakkuk asks. He's given 2 answers. He then gives a slew of woes, and then the book ends with a prayer. Well, his first question was, God, there's a lot of evil people around me here, my own people. Why aren't you doing something about it? The answer came back, I'll take care of it. The Babylonians are coming. Well, those people are worse than these people. I mean, it's just really wrestling with issues of justice and fairness. This isn't right, but that's not right, and what do we do? Well, in Qumran, and here is a section of the document 1Q Pesher Habakkuk. This is later columns. The first couple columns I didn't show you, but I'll show you the English in a minute because they were very damaged. But you can see here, written on the parchment, and the text right there. Now, how this document works is they will quote a line from Habakkuk, and then they will say, Pishro, the word Pesher, its interpretation is, and then they'll interpret it. So, the beginning, the oracle that the prophet Habakkuk saw, how long I have cried out and you do not hear. I cry out in justice and you do not liberate us. Habakkuk 1, verses 1 through 2. Pishro, its interpretation, its Pesher, this refers to the entreaty of the generations, text breaks off, the events to come upon us, the text breaks off, cried out, and then the text breaks off. And then, based on what was left of the text, we know that then the next section of Habakkuk was quoted. And then it would go back and forth. A quote from Habakkuk, its interpretation is. A quote from Habakkuk, its interpretation is, back and forth. Now what's most interesting about this is that we eventually come to sections in the text that start naming names. We wish they would have named names, actually. Because throughout this whole document, we have the teacher of righteousness mentioned. We have the wicked priest mentioned. And we have someone called the man of the lie. So the text will quote a section from Habakkuk, again, 6th century BC, And then we'll say, but its interpretation is about our teacher of righteousness in our community. Its interpretation is about that wicked priest up in Jerusalem, which many dissertations were written over who was the wicked priest. I mean, was it Shimon the Great? Was it this person? Lots of people tried to guess, and just once, it would have been just once if the authors of these texts had given us a footnote. By the way, we keep using this person, wicked priest. What we are referring to is John Hyrcanus. Just once if they had said that, it would have been fantastic, but they didn't. But you can see here how this text goes back and forth. It's taking the biblical text, and then it's looking at a modern reality and reading it right back into the text. The question kind of for us tonight is, do people still read the Bible like this today? And is it sometimes a dangerous phenomenon? Absolutely. Just to give you an example from my Multnomah days. Being back here for my drive to the airport, and then I actually went up to Mount Tabor for a little while today, because that was my respite back in the 90s. When I was an RA, if I'm on campus, I need to be available to my dorm section people. So I would get in the car and drive up to Mount Tabor and walk around for 8 hours just to be, for a half hour. But I went up the other day and just walked around because it is such a beautiful place up there. But all of these different memories come back. But for any of you that were here in the 90s, I think it was probably 93 or 94, you will remember a moment where someone prophesied that a great earthquake was going to happen and destroy the West Hills. Some of you might remember that. And I remember there were great discussions we had here at Multnomah, and even a couple students that left town for the weekend because they were concerned about this. And at least then it was this moment of, can that be true? Can that not be true? What's going on? What's not going on? Really trying to see how things are or are not, say, prophesied. And a text like this, it's really saying how we put this text into our community is more important than what the biblical writers ever meant for this text. Very narcissistic view of the Bible. With my students in my Dead Sea Scrolls class, I often tell them, you come in with a fascination of Qumran and the Dead Sea Scrolls, but this group was a little bit odd. This was a group that pulled away from kind of normative society and had very extreme views. They had very double predestinarian views. And they would basically say, yep, God chose us and damned everyone else. They were very intent on that. So we would not, had we been alive 2,000 years ago, we probably would not have been too comfortable with this group. But because their library survived and nobody else's library survived, they get a pride of place. I'll get to the question in just a minute. Oh, go ahead. Not in the way we often think of Gnosticism in the New Testament. They did have dualistic concepts, but it was much more like two spirits. But it's a good question. So now, back also in the 90s, some of you might remember the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas. I was really surprised when I was given an assignment to look at kind of messianic movements, apocalyptic movements, and so on when I was in Israel, and I stumbled across an article by a guy named James Tabor. James Tabor teaches in North Carolina. He's a Dead Sea Scrolls scholar, and he was actually brought in by the FBI to debate David Koresh on the phone. Bizarre. He wrote a whole book about this and actually is pretty scandalous toward the FBI. He felt the FBI was out of line in some of the things they did. But James Tabor was very fascinated with some of the passages David Koresh was using about himself, were similar passages that were also used in the Qumran community about the teacher of righteousness, or at least the same kind of concepts. So I thought this quote was very, very powerful. The FBI agents called to Mount Carmel Center outside Waco, Texas on February 28, 1993, can hardly be expected to have packed their Bibles. In retrospect, it would not have been such a bad idea. One of the reasons why I think it is so important, whether in faith communities or not, that people just have biblical knowledge, is so much of our society and our world is connected to various biblical understandings. But here's a Dead Sea Scrolls scholar that actually used his interaction with Qumran texts like the Pesher of Habakkuk, and all of a sudden realized people still read the Bible like this today, and it can have very, very bad outcomes. Very bad outcomes. If you know Branch Davidians, dozens and dozens of people, including a lot of children, were killed because of that. So as we look at kind of modern translations, All of you on your Bibles will have those footnotes that will say the LXX reads, or Dead Sea Scrolls read, or DSS reads, or Qumran. It's a lot of this new data that's coming up. But most of those notes are fairly mild. It's a little change of maybe a pronoun and a proper name, maybe a number that's a little different. And in a lot of ways, it is not, when it comes to revolutionary, anything going on. Had the scrolls been released before 1991, a lot of the sensationalism and the claims out there would have never happened. Books like the Dead Sea Scrolls Deception, or the various Vatican conspiracies, that somehow the Pope is trying to keep these under wraps because it's going to undermine Christianity. Books like the sensationalism of the Da Vinci Code have absolutely no connection to real scholarship. If a book ever makes the New York Times bestseller list that touches on Dead Sea Scrolls stuff, it's not right. Straight out, it's not right. Qumran data can help us read modern translations more inquisitively. Kind of really closely reading and saying, okay, what would the original readers of these texts have thought about when they came across items like 3 months? That's interesting. So much so that someone wrote a kind of historical fiction in a text like the Visions of Amram to at least maybe give a plausible suggestion. I was on a tour in Israel with the president of our university, and he started asking me a little bit about my research and Dead Sea Scrolls and what I did at UCLA. And all of a sudden he said, wait a minute. You're telling me you spent a lot of research time on documents that never made scripture and you're a Bible professor? Why did I hire you? No, but it was a funny moment where we can talk about the importance of these non-biblical texts for even understanding the world of Second Temple Judaism. And then finally, kind of how Qumran ideology and these non-biblical documents should really give us a caution in our modern interpretations. I mean, I love inductive Bible study. I mean, all of us at Multnomah, we love Ray Lubeck and we love those classes. But I will often caution my students. I would say, you know what? Getting alone with Scripture and reading it and really knowing it is wonderful to do. But every great heresy has usually happened because someone got alone with their Bibles and came up with something new and creative that no one else had thought about before. Because these texts are also meant to be read in community. So we're supposed to have that dynamic too. So if you ever come up with a creative new insight and a new theological concept, you were wrong. But we need to be careful and very humble about the way we handle the biblical text. How are we reading these translations in ways that are faithful to the text, but also keeping that moment of humility where we say, we may not be seeing this correctly. So how can we make sure by being in communities where we do that? So I will stop there and open it up to questions, and it can be questions on anything. But I do thank you. This was a wonderful time to kind of come back to my alma mater and just walk around today and realize that my dorm is no longer in existence. I walked out of the cafeteria and I said, there used to be a building there, and it's no longer there. But Multnomah is a very special place to me, and I thank all of you for being part of it. All right, any questions? Up until about 2 years ago, the standard answer was that Esther and Nehemiah were the two that were not found at Qumran. Ezra was found, so the assumption was Ezra and Nehemiah would have probably been written on the same scroll. So there was always assumption that Nehemiah was probably also there, but critters in the ground ate up that part of the leather, so it disappeared. There are Nehemiah fragments now. So every book in the Hebrew canon, except for Esther, has been discovered. I was that guy 20 years ago, so we're all good. Yes.
So, then the dilemma for me, or to some, is Esther's involvement in the canon itself. If such a large, even Obadiah is so tiny, yet that was found, and a few other books that are also pretty small. What is one to make of the Jews' perception of Esther in the Bible?
So quick answer to your question. Let's go back to when I said that this was a group that kind of pulled away from normative Judaism. And in a lot of ways, they had some very specific views. One of them may be the fact that there's debates on it, but this seems to have been a hyper-concerned and hyper-Torah observant and a group that was hyper-concerned about purity issues. And that the assumption is often that the community center right there at Qumran was like an all-male celibate group based on how you read some of the documents. So some thought is a book about a Jewish woman in a beauty contest marrying a foreign king somehow did not set well with their reading of other biblical books. That's just a fun book. No. No. So it could be that this one group had some issues against that book. But in our own Protestant tradition, are there any fairly significant Protestant voices that often did question even books in the New Testament? Luther questioned James. So even in our own heritage, we have some debates at times because of issues. So this one, at least, most scholars would say the Esther issue might be because they really were bothered by what Esther was doing and the kind of marrying the foreigner. But it also could be the fact that it just disappeared. Will it probably ever be found? No. But the Festival of Purim, which is embedded in Esther, was also not part of the Qumran calendar. So it seems like that whole thing was set aside. See, this group even went to a full solar calendar. The rest of Judaism had a lunar solar calendar that had to be intercalated every couple years by adding an extra month of Adar and things like that. But they didn't seem to even celebrate that holiday. So we got to say that they weren't kind of normative of Judaism, because the book of Esther is very significant and is a central event in a Jewish calendar.
Do you think it also might have something to do with the fact that God is never mentioned in the book of Esther?
Maybe. It would be nice to know if once in one of these Dead Sea Scrolls sectarian documents they had said, here is our list of canon and why Esther's not there. A book called Jubilees. There's a book called Jubilees that is known a lot in Ethiopic texts. It was somehow found its way into the Ethiopic canon. But it was found in many, many copies at Qumran. And some Dead Sea Scroll scholars would say, for this community, they may have even looked at something like Jubilees on the same level as other canonical books.
Try to get two questions in. One, the approximate time that the Qumran community existed.
Roughly 2nd century BC to 1st century AD. Yeah, it's about a 200 or so year window, and that's why we will often say that having the Masoretic text from about 1000 AD, and I'm being very rough with the numbers here, but finding the scrolls shaves off a whole millennium of that manuscript transmission. But again, right around this is what is amazing, where you have to kind of pinch yourself. The text that Multnomah students, APU students, and the ones we have in our special collection APU, they were in existence when the disciples and Jesus were living. I mean, it just makes you go, wow, goosebumps. So, second question.
And the other one was, do the Qumran texts have anything to say about books of Jasher or Enoch? Not a thing?
No. Some of those books we know in the Old Testament that were sources, no. Sure.
The Green Scholar Initiative, as you guys are going to be working on it at the two universities with students and the teachers, is there going to be an online, for people who are alumni who are not in school, will we be able to see some of the developments online?
Well, some of the research, because we already have contracts with Brill, the publisher Brill, to the Greens have with all of their material. So over the next year or two, texts and volumes are going to start coming out. So there will be access, and I would hope that all of our universities have a part in the volume of Dead Sea Scrolls. We'll have some kind of event at our university just celebrating that. But for now, at least, Carl's students, my students, all of it, we've all signed these non-disclosure agreements, and we're being secretive just like they were back in 1947 and following. But no, there will eventually be a time for that. And ultimately, all of this will be housed in this DC museum. Now, some of the items have been on a traveling exhibit called Passages. The Greens started in Oklahoma City, a small exhibit that has gone from Oklahoma City to Atlanta, to Charlotte, to Colorado Springs. It's been in Colorado Springs recently. And very soon by within a few weeks, they're going to have an exhibit down at the main cathedral in Havana, Cuba. I mean, that's a significant event. They've had a event with the Vatican, at the Vatican the last couple of years. So some of these items are already actually kind of public knowledge. So you can
Watch the site.
yeah, and that Google Green Collection, Google Passages Green, and you'll get some information on that. Yeah, what's fascinating right now, at least, is for any of you who keep up with the news too. Hobby Lobby has been in the news a lot lately because of the Supreme Court. There's a lot of other issues going on that people have often asked me about. But for the Green Collection and Green Scholars Initiative, there is some information and data you can find online. CNN had a great little video about a year ago or so on the Romans fragment that was part of the collection that you can Google CNN Green Collection and find out. Yes?
Can you talk a little bit more about the Samuel fragment? Because you said, you were like, well, this one's obviously probably more original than MT. And then scholars say it's one of the most significant things. Can you say more about that? Like, why was it decided it was more original?
Some of it is just, in I mean, the world of textual criticism, it can come down sometimes to prioritizing Qumran over Masoretic or vice versa. But the various rules of textual criticism, most text critics looking at that Samuel passage would say numbers tend to go bigger. Yeah, very few of us catch a 2-foot sturgeon and say it was actually a 6-inch sturgeon. I mean, none of us go that direction. The fact that it's 2,000 years older than, or 1,000 years older than the Masoretic text. The fact that that passage, if you look in the apparatus, already has a lot of movement with the numbers. But that, yeah. Correct. In the Septuagint, in Syriac, and other translations. When it comes to that one specific paragraph, that's really the largest kind of new addition that a lot of English translations are going to be going forward with. One that I didn't mention that is interesting is one of our APU fragments is Deuteronomy 27. Now I should throw out, okay, what's in Deuteronomy 27? But this is the Mount Gerizim, Mount Aval situation. Ooh, we know. Okay, so which one is good? Gerizim, G. Which one is evil? Evil. There we go. There's a little mnemonic device for you to remember. But the Deuteronomy 27 fragment that we have with our APU collection actually inverts and has Mount Gerizim, where all of our English translations say Mount Aval. So the question is, I'm sorry. The question is, could this be a Samaritan text that was Aval, that Samaritans changed it to Gerizim, which if you think John chapter 4, that makes a lot of sense. That whole discussion of on this mountain in Jerusalem, that interplay. But was Gerizim original, and in some kind of anti-Samaritan polemic, Jewish text got changed to Aval, and then that's what shows up in the Masoretic. That's an interesting interplay. Now, if you actually see Mount Gerizim and Mount Aval live, I mean, there's that one, here's that one. They're right next to each other geographically. But you do have some of those issues of variance going on that I think 20 years ago that would have definitely sometimes bothered me, like, okay, why are there these differences? But now it actually makes me curious. Like, okay, was there some kind of Jewish-Samaritan interplay? And that actually gives more background to John chapter 4. So it really can create a very interesting situation. So, all right, someone up here.
Yeah, I was wondering what the chances of getting passages up here for Washington, D.C.
Do you know what? Yeah, the question was passages. That's something the Green family with the Oklahoma City office. I think they have numerous places that have wanted it, and I'm sure they have some kind of protocol for the city has to have this and this and this or whatever. But I mean, it wouldn't surprise me. I don't know exactly where the next place is. I'm blown away though. It's going to Cuba. That's pretty significant. So, but all right, another question.
In regards to the Eshers, do we know, like, do we know any of their, like, hermeneutical frameworks for how they're interpreting these passages? Maybe something like Hillel's interpretive rules? Like, do we have something like that?
Yeah, they don't seem to be using the same types of rules, Hillel, like Kol Vahomer or any of those kinds of issues. They seem to have been much more concerned about localizing these texts within their community and showing the internal conflict that they experienced was already there embedded in the text. Which for some New Testament scholars, they like looking at the Qumran text to say, okay, what can we see about the way certain quotes are given in the New Testament? Last week in the Sunday school class at our church, I was teaching on Hosea and the out of Egypt I've called my son. And I mean, some of those interesting ones that we have to look at too and say, okay, so what are the hermeneutical rules that early Christian writers were using with some of these passages? So, yeah.
I did a few research projects in the 60s and 70s on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it's wonderful to see the evolution of how much more we understand now. But I remember one of the scholars that I read conjectured that the caves at Qumran weren't necessarily all just the Qumran community. It could have been when the Romans came in, everybody was taking their scrolls out for safekeeping and putting them there. Is that view still held, or do they now feel, because there's so much of it? I mean,
So the question was, of the 11 caves, were they all connected to the settlement? Were none of them connected to the settlement? Were they Essene? Were they non-Essene? Were they Sadducean? I mean, you have a lot of those kinds of debates going on. So for example, the Essene hypothesis is the dominant one still, and that the caves, except maybe cave 3, are connected to the settlement. And one of my mentors along the way, Hanan Eshel, archaeologist, he proved that by taking a metal detector, very simple, and actually found little Roman sandal nails directly from the settlement to some of these caves. So they are connected, the cave and that settlement. Now, cave 3 is sometimes set aside because it's quite a ways up the valley, closer like heading toward Jericho, and it's the one that had some very strange documents like the Copper Scroll. I mean, of all Dead Sea Scrolls, that one, scholars still scratch their heads. What was this document that was embedded in copper and had all of these treasures, 60-some treasures that you walk to this rock, dig down, and you'll find so many talents of gold. Some of you may have come across the book The Copper Scroll. That was a popular fictional book that came out a few years ago. I had not heard of it, but I was on an airplane, and someone I was sitting next to had it. I looked at her and said, that's an interesting book. She said, oh, you've got to read it. And then when I told her what I do with some Dead Sea Scrolls, oh, you really, I mean, this unlocks, this is the magic here. This unlocks it. Well, this book, by the time you get to the end, you have a shootout kind of underneath by the Siloam Tunnel that actually goes underneath the Temple Mount, and the Mossad and FBI, CIA are shooting out terrorists to find the Ark of the Covenant, and it's all there in the Copper Scroll, just waiting. So some of these mysterious texts they're just waiting for some kind of conspiracy theory. But Cave 3 is farther up the valley. It's one that people have said maybe this one is not connected to the settlement. But all the other ones, most scholars would say it is. Now, some of you may have followed the news in the last few years that there was this huge kind of debate going on between Norman Golb at the University of Chicago and other Qumran scholars on issues of, was the settlement and the caves connected? But that one got strange because Norman Golb's son actually started writing writing in the name of scholars like Lawrence Schiffman and others to graduate students of these people saying, I'm a plagiarist, you need to leave my university. I mean, some really strange stuff that was actually, he was found guilty of kind of fraud and other things. And it was all about whether or not the settlement was or was not the Essenes. I mean, this is where you have to take a step back as a scholar and say, sometimes people get way too invested in something that we need a little bit more kind of grace. I think that's what's the beauty of being a scholar having little kids. Because you can come home and say, hey, this is what I did. And they're like, let's go play football. I mean, it's like, yeah, that does not matter. So, but does that answer your question? Okay. Any others? All right, well, thank you. I'll be here if, oh, there we go.
Maybe one last question. Is there one book that could give a synopsis of the significance of the discoveries that were made with the Dead Sea Scrolls? What one book would you
I would say The Ancient Library of Qumran by Frank Moore Cross would be one. Anything by James Vanderkam is a good read. He's a very good writer, Notre Dame professor, and he writes very cogently. So it's one that you don't get caught up. If you want a little bit of an alternate perspective, a Jewish perspective, Lawrence Schiffman. Some of his works out there are very, very good. So those three would be ones. Right. The Ancient Library of Qumran by Frank Moore Cross Jr. He passed away about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. It was recently, but he was one of the original Dead Sea Scrolls scholars in Jerusalem, in East Jerusalem. So the Ancient Library of Qumran by Frank Moore Cross. James Vanderkam, he has a book on early Judaism. I forget the exact title right now. And then another one just on the Dead Sea Scrolls, James Vanderkam. And then Lawrence Schiffman. He's at New York University, I believe, and he writes some very good stuff on the scrolls. You know, my dissertation was it's one document, one narrow, and even my dad bought a copy of it, brought it home, said, I got through 2 pages, and I'm done. And I think those are actually the 2 pages of the thanking my family and friends, and he's like, now I'm done. But, so, all right, well, thank you for being here tonight.
Thanks so much, Bobby. That was great. Very enlightening. For those of you who are Multnomah alum or students, I meant to tell you this earlier. I have a window cling for you to proudly promote your alma mater or your university. And for those of you, our friends who are visiting, we have some Multnomah literature too out there on the table. And I would just really encourage you to, students and alumni, to get to know, if you don't have to run off right away, to get to know one another. And even our APU friends who live here in the community, we'd love to just hang out a little bit and visit. Again, thanks so much, Bobby.
Okay, when did you graduate? For my, yeah, my sister would have been there 1 year.